When Spanish conquistadors conquered and began to settle the New World piece by piece, they encountered levels of wealth that were almost unimaginable. Most famously, Francisco Pizarro and 160 conquistadors under his command captured Atahualpa, lord of the Incan Empire, in 1532, and he offered to pay a ransom of a room filled with gold and then twice over with silver. The room was 22 feet long by 17 feet wide. So much precious metals flowed into Europe from this that it turned the market for gold and silver upside down. Such incredible levels of wealth fired the imaginations of Spanish conquistadors and led to all sorts of different myths. One of these was El Dorado, the gilded man, who, legend held, was daily powdered from head to toe with gold dust, which he would then wash from himself in a lake whose bottom was now covered with gold dust and the golden trinkets tossed in his sacrificial offerings. Another legend was La Canela, the Valley of Cinnamon, which would be overflowing with the valuable spice at the time in Europe was worth more than its weight in gold, literally. Now, these sound like fables, but it led to incredibly dangerous expeditions that were undertaken. One in question, which is the focus of today's episode, is a 1541 expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro, the younger brother of Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro and his well-born lieutenant, Francisco Orellana, set off in search of La Canela. But quickly, the enormous retinue of mercenaries, enslaved natives, horses, and hunting dogs were decimated by disease, starvation, and attacks in the jungle. They were hopelessly lost in the swampy labyrinth, and Pizarro and Orellana made a fateful decision to separate. When Pizarro eventually returned home barefoot in rags, Orellana and 57 men continued downriver into the unknown reaches of the Amazon jungle and river. This was the first Spanish voyage down the Amazon. To talk about this expedition and how it permanently altered the fate of South America is Buddy Levy, author of the book River of Darkness, Francisco Orellana, and the Deadly First Voyage Through the Amazon. We get into a great deal about what a 16th century expedition through the jungle looks like, and long story short, it's incredibly dangerous, dealing with disease, natives who could sometimes be friendly, sometimes hostile, or shoot poison arrow darts at you. But it's also an important look at what was happening during the Age of Discovery. Hope you enjoyed this discussion with Buddy Levy. The last time we spoke, you told the story of the 1881 Greely expedition to reach farthest north, which ended up resulting in all sorts of problems. Insanity, threats of mutiny, cannibalism. Well, we're going to thankfully return to warmer climates, but there are similar challenges we're going to see with the first Spanish voyage to the Amazon in 1541 by Francisco Orellana and his search for the El Dorado, the fabled golden man. So what originally led you to the story several years ago?
Hey, Scott, thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it. Yeah, that's an interesting story and somewhat, I guess, circuitous. So I had written a book called Conquistador that came out in 2008. And, that's the story of the fateful meeting of Cortez and Montezuma and the vanquishing by the Spaniards of the Aztec Empire in a very short time. And at that time, I really did not know, maybe bad history instruction as a youth, but I didn't know very much about conquistadors and the Spanish conquest of the New World. And so during the couple-year period I was working on Conquistador, I came across all sorts of tales that were, I wouldn't say equally interesting, because that's one of the greatest stories in the history of history. But I did bump into this story about Orellana, and it was relatively obscure. And so, meaning that there hadn't been a tremendous amount written about it. There had been a pretty cool film, which I'll touch on a little bit in part of the story of my journey down the Amazon, but a film by a notable filmmaker named Werner Herzog, which I talk about in the epilogue. It was Pedro de Ursua and this film that starred Klaus Kinski, and it was really wild. And so I had actually seen that some years before, but I started digging into the story of, I guess, essentially the quest for El Dorado, which is what led me to this particular tale, because that's kind of what got them started. And when I started reading about it, I was like, it just had everything that I love in adventure history. I mean, it had, meetings of people that hadn't ever encountered each other before and lots of hardship. It had a ton of natural history and encounters with the natural world for which the Spaniards were pretty much unprepared. And then it also had this epic journey. And so I decided to just dig in and learn as much as I could about it. And because I had, coming off the heels of Conquistador, my editor at the time at Random House was really intrigued when I told him about it. He didn't know the story either. And he said, he sort of turned me loose and said, go for it. And then I started researching and immediately booked a a trip to South America back in, that was like '08.
Well, it's very interesting and it's a fascinating story. Like you said, it's a time that all these new encounters are happening. It's a bit surprising that you think, how do people actually believe this? A myth like El Dorado, it sounds like believing in centaurs, but with geography being so limited, and they truly are in terra incognita, you can give them plenty of grace for that. But broadly speaking, before getting into the particulars of the story, since you've written a number of things about conquistadors, could you tell me about the state of the Spanish Empire and their expansion into the New World at this time? This is a few decades into their colonization. Broadly speaking, what is the state of play at this time in 1541?
Right. So a lot has happened in a very short time. By the time Orellana and Gonzalo Pizarro are set to go down in search of this golden man, Cortez has conquered Mexico City and the Aztecs around 1521 and has been sending, shiploads and shiploads of gold and plunder from Tenochtitlan back to Spain, which is sort of piquing the interest and and not only gold but also bringing back, they brought back humans, they brought back animals, they brought back, all sorts of antiquities that they got in the city. And then that fueled even further expansion desire, so that by this, maybe a decade later, we have, simultaneously, Francisco Pizarro is heading to Panama and beginning to assault further south than Mexico. And in 1535-6, Francisco Pizarro has essentially taken over the Inca Empire. And so by this time, there's a steady stream of conquistadors looking to make their name through conquest, exemplary military service, and also by this time, the crown is giving to these successful conquistadors large tracts of land that, anything that they can subdue and conquer. It was pretty absolutely terrible what was going on. But from the perspective of the Spaniards, this is land and people for the taking. And so Orellana is related to the Pizarros, and he ends up teaming up with Francisco Pizarro's, one of his younger brothers, half-brother technically, named Gonzalo Pizarro, this brutal young conquistador. And all of these other expeditions have been coming back from Venezuela and Colombia, and they're all sort of converging in Peru and Ecuador. And there starts to be this talk about, because everybody's finding gold or being given gold from the people they're overtaking. And there starts to be this talk about this golden man who is rumored to live somewhere over the Andes from Quito, Ecuador, and somewhere down river where this lake so in the myth, the golden man is daily anointed with this sort of sticky tar substance over which he's flecked with gold flakes and completely covered so that he looks like a golden man. And then when he bathes in the lake every day, there's so much gold has been deposited on that the bottom of the lake is virtually like filled with gold. So this is the kind of now, and given that Cortez has been highly successful, Francisco Pizarro has pilfered much of the Inca gold. It was reasonable to believe, given the amount of gold they're acquiring, that this story has some validity. And so that was that. And there was another element to it, which was that there was rumored to be this land of cinnamon over the Andes. And so in addition to going to look for more gold, the conquistadors were trying to find these great stands of cinnamon, which from the time of Columbus had been spices were highly prized. So that was like a double-edged or sort of a two-pronged approach to sort of fueling their desire.
One last thing before we get into the expedition itself. What do you make of them planning a dangerous trip for what sounds like pure fantasy, especially El Dorado? What do you think is going through their minds? Is terra incognita providing so many strange things that they're almost willing to believe anything? Or do they assume, well, perhaps the story isn't true, but we've seen so much gold flow through this continent that the result could be almost equally fantastical. So who cares if it's a gold man bathing or there just happens to be really productive mines in the area. What do you think is going through their minds? Seems like they're planning a dangerous expedition based on fantasy.
Well, yeah. I mean, what's interesting is when you read the book and you get into the later chapters and epilogue, that myth of the Golden Man persisted for well over 100 years, even beyond Oriana. And so I do think it's true that there was essentially just a gold fever that was going on. So whether or not there's a Golden Man, they're thinking there's gold. And so that was enough. That was enough to sort of spark the imagination and the desire for wealth, riches. And these conquistadors had already seen, Cortez had become fabulously rich in land and titles. And so there's just a bit of gold lust and greed, I guess, And there is that element of unknown that you brought up. So the idea of discovering something new that has never before been discovered for Spain carried with it a lot of weight, in terms of what that could garner you with lands and titles and everything else that came with it.
To be fair, I suppose in the modern day era, we have our cryptocurrency pump and dump schemes where a completely unviable cryptocurrency, a person can lose their life savings. So there's something about a lot of money being at stake that just shuts down people's prefrontal cortexes and lets them believe almost anything they hear. So who knows, maybe something else was going on there.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also the element of what I always have to remind myself is that the conquistadors are so far away from Spain and it takes so long to get information back and forth by boat that it's kind of like they go rogue, essentially. It's essentially lawless, even though they're writing letters back to the king and they're, sort of having to report their actions. They understand that it's going to be a really long time, and this was true with Cortez, that it's going to be a really long time before, they get a response. So it's basically like, ask for forgiveness rather than permission, and they just went ahead and did what they were going to do.
Well, speaking of which, there's a lot of people in their retinue who fit this profile and are guilty of all sorts of criminal activity, many of other conquistadors as well. So can you tell me about the formation of their retinue and their plans for the expedition and how the expedition began?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was fairly quickly cobbled together, I would say, for an expedition of this magnitude. I mean, when Pizarro, he was in charge, Gonzalo Pizarro, with Francisco Orellana as the second in command. And since they didn't really know where they were going or what they were going to encounter, it was really amazing. Like the start of this thing is, I've always tried to visualize what it must have looked like, in a cinematic way, because they had like 4,000 bearers. They call them bearers. It's sort of a euphemism for slaves, native bearers garnered around Quito, Ecuador. And then they had something like 250 swine that they're going to herd over the mountains. And if you've been to Quito or the Andes, I mean, Quito's at almost 10,000 feet, and then it goes up to about 14,000 feet from there, this pass of Papayacta. And so they've got, 4,000 bearers carrying their stuff. They've got weaponry. They've got a few hundred horses. Got a couple hundred mastiff ward hounds that they're going to use to terrorize native populations if they encounter any problems. And they take off basically, Gonzalo Pizarro goes first, heads over the mountains, and then Orellana is supposed to follow up some weeks later after he gets some more provisions and gear and food. And they run into trouble like right out of the gate, because as they get up into the mountains, so many of these bearers are not equipped with enough clothing, food. So there's a bit of dissension and they start to scatter, and then the entire retinue is besieged, or deluged, I should say, by massive rains. And there's this Antisana volcano that's erupting as they're heading up the mountains, and they're actually experiencing rumblings and earthquakes. And so it's really difficult, and it takes a long time. And when they finally do reconvene over on the other side of the Andes, well above actually the Coca and the Napo rivers, where they're going to finally take to the water, they're in somewhat rough shape already. And what they also don't understand or didn't plan for, they couldn't have fully known, was that horses were not a great idea, because the country is really, once they get over the flinty, cliffy, rocky mountains, it begins to be more temperate and boggy. And when they start to get to the river bottoms, it's thick, dense forest and flooded forest. And so the horses are like bogging up to their bellies, and it's an absolute disaster, sort of out of the gate. And so then they're having to eat their horses and having to eat all the swine, and the native bearers have all bailed. And this is like before they've even started the hard part of heading down the river.
As a quick aside, you've looked at different failed expeditions. I mentioned at the top of the episode your analysis of the attempt in the 1880s to reach furthest north. And there have been other horrible failed overland expeditions in history. One of the worst, I think, is the People's Crusade in the First Crusade, where you basically have a bunch of rabble and religious zealots who do no planning. They eat by pillaging village to village, and then they get captured and sold into slavery because they fail so terribly because they didn't plan at all. Where would you put this expedition on that continuum? Would you blame their troubles for poor planning, or was it simply they didn't have the knowledge to be able to plan and execute the type of expedition they wanted?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in this case, based on, the prototype or the prototypical conquistador model, they were operating with some history on their side that had worked, right? At least in the example of Cortez. But it was more about what they couldn't know, which was how immense, for one thing, the Amazon basin is. They had no knowledge of that. And also the kind of terrain that they were going to be encountering. And so, they just didn't have enough information to equip themselves in a way, that would have been appropriate, which is hard to, it's weird thinking about it now, because I'm thinking like, what, even if they had known what they were encountering, it was going to be very difficult to provide enough food for a few hundred men, because they weren't able to really bring enough. It was a good attempt with the swine, but it didn't last very long.
Right. They could, I suppose, imagine they could forage or do whatever to get resources, but that's a lot of people to provide that many resources for when you don't have large settled populations or markets where they're going. Before really drilling into their troubles, can you describe just in general what their expedition looks like? You mentioned they start in modern day Ecuador on the Pacific side of South America, and then they move east. As they're going along the Amazon, they're also stopping in different villages. What does the general day-to-day nature of their expedition look like?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. They were fortunate in a number of respects in that the first populations that they encountered were helpful to them, at least. But I have to say that something happened quite early on, which kind of was the defining moment of the expedition. So by the time they left in around March of 1541, around Christmas time, they're in really, really terrible shape, and to the point where they're pretty much starving. And at that point, Orellana makes a decision that he proposes to Pizarro that they've learned from some native populations that there may be these manioc plantations, like kind of a tuber root, kind of like a potato, that are downstream a few days travel. And by this time, they've built a couple of boats. They figured out, that they're on foot. The horses are all eaten, and they're going to have to. They build a couple of boats, and Pizarro agrees to let Orellana go downstream, try to find these plantations, and bring back food. This ended up being like a really fateful moment, because trying to move back upstream was just never going to be a viable possibility. But Pizarro didn't think of it, and the river at this stage, even at this high up, is incredibly powerful river. And so Orellana takes 57 men, leaving Pizarro and I think a couple hundred at that point, and says he'll be back in 12 days. Well, once he's going headlong down the river, Orellana is never to see Pizarro again. And so the tale separates there at that point, and I follow Orellana and his men, and what at that point it's an expedition of discovery, interweaving the story of what happened to Gonzalo Pizarro, because he ended up trying to strike back and find a way back to Quito. which his ordeal is a separate few chapters interspersed and so I cut back and forth between what's happening with Oriana and what's happening with Pizarro. And, Pizarro has its own little, I mean, it's months of hell, months of just unbelievable hacking with machetes. By the time they end up back in Quito, they're literally in rags and barefooted and just with a sword in one hand and a walking staff in the other. And I think 80 members have died, and it's gruesome and grim. And he also at that point vows, he thinks that Oriana is a traitor for not coming back, not really knowing that there was no way he could have come back because he's been washed so far downstream by this point. And Oriana is trying to survive and keep his men alive.
Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors. But first, I want to give a shout out to all the great shows on the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Key Battles of American History. You can find this show and many other great ones like it by going to parthenonpodcast.com. Well, let's switch to Oriana once he starts moving downstream. What happens to him and his men in this part of the expedition?
Right. So it's really amazing. Now, Oriana, I look at as I guess this is a phrase that you can take how you want. I think he's a kinder, gentler conquistador in the sense that, so just to backtrack for a minute, Gonzalo Pizarro, when they were trying to figure out, once they got and figured out there wasn't going to be very much cinnamon, they found some small scraggly trees and he wasn't seeing any gold and he's just meeting, small communities living in huts along the river. So he starts torturing people and burning their feet to tell them basically what he wants to hear, which is that if you keep going, there's going to be, rich kingdoms further downstream. What really separated Oriana, I think, was early on, his approach was not to, rape, pillage, and conquer, which was essentially the conquistador model, but to try to communicate and get as much information as he could as he went and move in peace, essentially. And he was really an intelligent person. And he brought along a friar, as many of them did, a priest who would be the scrivener and transcribe all of the information and record their journey. But also he began studying language, and everyone he met, Oriana essentially created his own dictionary of terminology so that he would have a better opportunity to communicate. And so his approach as he first began moving down the river was to try to land, if possible, and talk to the people and not draw weapons and not steal anything at the beginning, not steal anything and not kill anyone. And just sort of, because he realized this river is massive and I don't know where I'm going. And I may need these people as allies, or at least for them not to kill me. And what's interesting is that as they went, they were told different things by different groups. Some groups were very accommodating and even let them stay for like a month at a time in their village, feeding them, teaching them how to harvest and cook manioc and other plants, showing them how to hunt there's a ton of food if you know how to get it. All sorts of, there's rodents the size of dogs and there's jaguars and there are lots of fish and there's just, there's howler monkeys, there's everything. But so some of the groups of people that they encountered would sort of house them and let them, improve their boat and keep going. But as they got farther and farther toward the Atlantic, they began to encounter hostile tribes. And that's when things got much, much more difficult.
Right. When they encounter the Amazons, there's one of the members suffers an injury. Can you describe that encounter?
Well, many of them. So one of the things is that, Friar Carvajal, who is recording all of this, actually takes an arrow in the eyeball and loses his eye. But one of the most devastating things that they encountered were poison tree frog darts. And so some of these tribes had figured out that there's a particular tree frog, that if you can get a sort of venom out of it, and it's incredibly deadly. And they would put the tips of their darts, little hand-thrown darts, plus arrows and spears in this tree frog poison. And I mean, some of the members are struck, and it's absolutely macabre what happens. They didn't really know what was going on, but say one guy gets shot in the leg and his leg begins to turn black and bloats up to about 2 times its normal size. And then they go into a kind of epileptic seizure followed by paralysis and death. And this is happening, while they're floating along because they've been attacked in the boat. Sometimes they go ashore. Sometimes they're attacked from shore and they're in their boat just trying to get past maybe 1,000 warriors. And so it took them a few times of witnessing this to put it together that it was these tree frog poison darts that were doing it, at which point they had to pull over and, build some protective shields along the side of the boat that came up and leaned in so that they could hunker down and hide as these thousands of arrows are raining down on them.
As they go along, eventually the expedition reaches the Atlantic Ocean. They have to retrofit their boats for seaworthiness. Can you describe, did they have any impression of what they thought when they reached the other side and they were at the Atlantic? There was no El Dorado. There were no vast fields of cinnamon and wealth and stories that you would hear about the Spice Islands, things like that.
Yeah, well, the one thing, though, Orellana was paying very close attention to everything that he saw along the way. And one of the things that he noticed, and as they got down near the people called the Omagua and the Machipara, is that the civilization he encountered was much more elaborate and larger than I think he anticipated. And I mean, we're talking, villages of thousands of people at certain places. And so even though he's only getting, he knows he's just essentially passing through. I mean, this all takes place in, less than 2 years, a little over a year and a half or so. And so all the time that he's moving downriver, he's paying very close attention to what he's seeing. And sometimes, he's seeing really well organized villages that have essentially, that have turtle farms that are really organized. And he sees roads that are heading off into the interior, which tantalizes him also by thinking that there might be large kingdoms. So it's all about thinking about maybe there's going to be a kingdom on the order of the Aztec Empire or the Inca Empire that Orellana can now come back and conquer. Because I think with 57 men at the start, he understands that this is really about survival. If he can get through and then maybe return with a larger, more equipped fleet, then he can maybe, come back and conquer to the extent that Cortez or Pizarro had done. But when that trip you describe, one of the things that's really remarkable is just how vast everything is. As they get near the Atlantic, there are places where the Amazon River there at the Atlantic is like as much as 50 miles wide. And remarkably, there are islands the size of Switzerland and so they're just sort of blown away by the scope and scale of it all. And I was really amazed by their ingenuity, because by the time they get near the mouth of the Amazon, and they're sort of, the ships are in terrible condition. And so they have to make land, and surviving on basically shellfish and crabs and fish for a few weeks. They retrofit the ships using what cotton they have from their clothing and blankets and stuff to make sails. And they use vines that they're finding in the forest for cordage and line. And then they're able to actually sail, north up the coast of what is now, Brazil to Venezuela, where there's the Spanish outpost there. And at that point, all the time, Orellana is thinking about returning, because right now, he's just done essentially reconnaissance that's never been done before. And so he's got to go then to try to, figure out if he can convince the crown and the king to allow him to return, which he does.
Well, first of all, the two minor epilogues of the story. Pizarro does not find civilization in a dignified way. As you mentioned, he's starving. He looks like an island refugee. What eventually happens to Pizarro?
Right. Well, that's a mess. So Pizarro, by the time he gets back, he ends up becoming essentially the governor and then self-proclaimed essentially king of Peru. So he ends up taking over power. There's all sorts of Spanish power struggle going on there, and there are these rival factions of Spaniards who have been ensconced there for a while, and so there's a bunch of infighting among the Spaniards about political power struggle. Eventually, Pizarro sort of ascends, and this takes about maybe a little less than a decade, but he ultimately is overtaken from his self-proclaimed seat and beheaded by other Spaniards. So he finds a really inglorious end, to his efforts. He's temporarily got a ton of power and wealth, but it doesn't last. And when I focus more on the river itself and the expedition of Orellana and, his attempt to return, which ends up not working out very well either.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, to explore that as much as we can, what happens to Orellana when he hopes to come back and become part of this collect pantheon of great conquistadors?
Right. So things go pretty well at the beginning. So he comes back with these amazing stories of this new place that the Spaniards have never been before. It's immense and massive. There's at least it looks like there are civilizations to plunder, and so he gains audience with the king and convinces him that if he would support a return journey and it's better equipped with more soldiers and larger boats, that he'll be able to garner something worthwhile for the empire. And he ends up returning during the time that he's back in Spain. Orellana takes a young wife, and then he outfits 2 ships, some 300 men, and they sail back. But all sorts of trouble happens. There's a shipwreck and there's starvation on the boats. And when Orellana ends up heading back into the mouth of the Amazon, at this point, he's traveling upstream for one thing, and also he can't really find his way to a main tributary. It is so serpentine and circuitous in there that he sails around and around and around for months, and ultimately they're all scattered and they're starving, and he ends up perishing on the banks of the river that, ironically, when he left Gonzalo Pizarro, he had left in search of food, and he ends up on the banks of the river, and all the men are starving and searching for food. And, his wife says he died of grief.
Well, one thing I'm curious about is the legacy of this expedition. You mentioned that Orellana was a kinder, gentler conquistador, and this was a very violent time period. The administration of the colonies, it sounds like crime families organizing things, which isn't terribly far from the truth.
Yep.
But then you have figures, you talked about Carvajal recording indigenous languages on the expedition. Other people in different places in time, like Bartolomé de las Casas, another priest who's advocating very strongly for better treatment of natives. What do you see as the result of this trip? And there's something I like in your book. You mentioned that they found an El Dorado, but it wasn't in the way that the conquistadors initially believed.
Right. Yeah, well, okay, a couple of things on that. I'm glad you brought up de las Casas because, he lobbied very heavily for reformation of the treatment of indigenous populations. And for a time, there was actually a hold on, this is after, I think around 1550 to 60, there was a bit of a halt on expansion because people like de las Casas had recorded all of these atrocities. And he was saying essentially, you're going to go to hell. We're going to go to hell if we keep doing this kind of thing. And there was a huge debate, a kind of philosophical debate, but it ultimately, they sort of took off the hold and said, okay, expansion can begin again. But, the kinder, gentler conquistador, I think, was by necessity more than anything else, because Orellana understood that he didn't have the manpower but I do think he didn't see the point in just merciless killing unless he was attacked. So I think it was a combination of his temperament and also the situation at hand, where he certainly didn't have the manpower to do battle with these large armies, even though they did have some firearms, but not many. But, what's interesting to me, and I cover this in the epilogue, is that there were subsequent attempts, because this place was still so vast and so undiscovered by the European world that it remained intriguing and enticing. So, people like Sir Walter Raleigh in, I think, 1585 goes there, and it does this expedition and goes, and then there's like forays up the Orinoco. The other thing that this, I guess, as far as legacy goes, is there's beginning to be a comprehension of just how incredibly vast this place is. So, you've got maybe, I don't know, 500 tributaries of the Amazon. So it's not like the idea that it's one river is wrong. It's just this braided series of rivers, across the continent, that many of which filter into the main river. And, and so there's the ongoing notion that this is still a big, big place that we can maybe go find resources and take them. And so when I mentioned that in the intro of the new edition, it's that this golden dream, to me, it ends up being the place itself. It's just a remarkable, one of a kind ecosystem that the world only has one of, and that, it's sort of time to rethink. There are all sorts of new and ongoing affronts to the Amazon basin that, include cattle farming and giant dam building and deforestation. And so I think one of the things that this book tells us is that, because what I try to do is give the reader a sense of what it was like in 1541 to 42 on the ground, because I traveled, for 3-4 weeks down the river trying to get a sense of what it was like. And that in many parts of this place, it's still like that, but it won't be forever if we keep letting big oil and big timber and big cattle do what they're doing.
There's one last bit that we weren't able to touch on our discussion, but I think this is important and something that you emphasize in your telling of the story, is that when we mention these expeditions where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of porters and indigenous helpers / slaves / those who will do the grunt work, but then also provide the local knowledge and expertise, sometimes serve as translators, even though they form the bulk of the manpower and sometimes provide, or many times provide, the information that keeps the expedition from being a complete disaster, their story gets overlooked. How do you try to tell their story and their experience in this expedition?
Yeah, that is a really great question. So, and it's hard because the written record is in many cases scant. In the case of the book I wrote, Conquistador, I benefited from a number of works that after the fact were written with the help of Spanish translators by the Aztecs who had been conquered. But then these priests stayed around for like 40 years and wrote these great codices that, and there's one called The Broken Spears that's really, really powerful in the language of the conquered. Less that I have found exists in the Amazon basin, but I have to say that one of the most intriguing things, and this is, I maybe touch a little bit on this in the end part of my book, is that there's a lot we learn from the archaeology that tells its own story about the cities that were there. And I had the great fortune of meeting with major archaeologist named Anna Roosevelt, who is still at the University of Chicago. And she's done a lot of work at the far eastern end of the river doing these digs. And what they're finding is that, the pottery shards that they're finding and these mounds that they've found suggest that the story that Orellana, told about because he was doubted about, the size of the places he says that he was encountering. But then a lot of the modern archaeology bears out that what he was seeing was true. Yeah, I wish there was more of a written record of, and maybe since it's been a decade, there's more. I'll go take a look for sure.
Well, this is another really great addition to help our understanding of the age of exploration and the dangers involved, the personalities involved, and what was at stake and the far-reaching effects of what happened in these decades. And for listeners who want to get into the story in much more detail, the name of Buddy's book is River of Darkness, Francisco Orellana, and the Deadly First Voyage Through the Amazon. Buddy, thank you for joining us.
Scott, thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
All right, that is all for today's episode. If you'd like to see show notes for this and all my other episodes and include sources, maps, or other relevant information, go to parthenonpodcast.com. Parthenon is the name of the podcast network that History Unplugged is a part of, along with other great history shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other shows as well.